The Mediterranean, Turkey, 2nd century BC. For over 200 years now, ever since Romanticism first caught fire, artists, poets, writers, painters, musicians, and dramatists have never grown tired of measuring themselves against the irrational, the colossal. But was Romanticism really such a revolutionary step? Or was it just a case of history repeating itself? Thanks to the work of archaeologists and art historians on thousands of statues, bas-reliefs, and buildings, we now see that another great cultural revolution started in the year 323 BC that would last for centuries. In recent decades, excavations in Ionia, modern-day Turkey, have brought to light incomparable masterpieces in a style we would now describe as modern, even romantic. Come with us as we explore the marriage of Greek and Persian civilizations and a resultant culture called Hellenism. During the 4th century BC, Asia Minor, Africa, and the rest of the then-known Orient were turned upside down by a military and political earthquake that changed the course of history. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing like it has happened since. The man who brought about this upheaval was the youngest military adventurer of all time, Alexander the Great. Alexander's Macedonian phalanxes swept down on people and cultures like a whirlwind, but not just a military one. The Macedonian conquests created a cultural tornado as well. Alexander brought with him a Greek culture that was adopted, reworked, and transformed by artists from different ethnic backgrounds, who drew inspiration from it and invented a new way of conceiving art. We now attribute this to the period known as Hellenistic. Alexander brought Ionia, the Phoenician region, and Egypt under his control. To the east, he conquered the entire Persian Empire as far as the Indus River. After him, nothing was as it had been before, and Greece, paradoxically, now that its culture had spread everywhere, lost its importance, its central role. Kingdoms sprang up in Egypt, Syria, Macedonia, and at Pergamum in what is now Turkey. These kingdoms signaled the dawn of a new period, the period we know as Hellenism. Of the many art forms involved in this revolution, the one that most clearly shows the change is sculpture. This is the celebrated Hermes of Praxiteles, discovered at Olympia, one of the most important works of art before Alexander. In other words, classic Greek art. Here the artist seeks balance, clean lines, and perfection of form, a harmony based on aesthetic canons that lay down mathematical proportions and are quite independent of reality. This statue is the Cleopatra of Delos. It is from the Hellenistic period, and it is not famous and not particularly valuable. But the mere fact that it is rather commonplace gives us an insight into the artist's mind. He's interested in everyday reality, real people, their traits, their features. We can see the women's fashion of the day. which went for almost see-through fabrics. Rendering draperies this fine was a real test of skill for the Hellenistic sculptor. As Greece expanded its realm throughout the Middle East, its own artists and craftsmen, looking for creative inspiration, were enticed to check out the flourishing cities on the other side of the Aegean. They headed for Ephesus and Pergamum, cities of present-day Turkey. In Ephesus, archaeologists found this frieze, a hunting scene, a wild boar pursued by an officer on horseback. This bas-relief was a source of great puzzlement for them, first because it is usual for Greek art to depict scenes from mythology, and then because of the hunter's clothes. Assembling all the fragments they found, the scholars solved the mystery. The scene was part of the great frieze sculpted in this little temple, which was later rebuilt, the Temple of Hadrian at Ephesus. The stones tell a story in pictures, and by studying them, we can identify the legend from which the sculptor drew his inspiration. Androclus, the son of King Codrus of Athens, learns from the oracle of Apollo that he will be driven out of Athens, and that a fish and a boar will choose a place for him to found a new city. Arriving on the coast of Anatolia, he lights a fire and cooks a fish. A spark starts a fire in the underbrush, and he sees a boar running from it. Androclus chases the boar, and at the exact spot where he kills it, he founds the city of Ephesus. The city we see today dates only from later Roman times, but the streets are the same and laid out with gridiron simplicity, so different from the chaotic nature of streets in Athens. This way of laying out cities was born just south of here in the Hellenistic city of Miletus, the birthplace of the first urban planner to design orderly, regular cities. His name was Hippodamus of Miletus, and his city planning theory spread to other Greek cities, then to the Romans, who built their cities on regular line patterns, and right down to our own city planning in the present day. At Ephesus, the right-angled streets also serve to differentiate between neighborhoods. This neighborhood, known as the Slope, was particularly wealthy. The houses have sumptuously decorated interiors. And here, carefully secluded in the side streets, is a bordello, a house of assignations. Like many houses in the city, it was luxurious, with heating facilities and hot and cold water. There is an interesting advertisement on the main street indicating the presence of the bordello close by. A heart, a woman's face, and a foot showing which direction to take. Here we see a great library built around a tomb. Archaeologists had never found anything like this before from the ancient world. A building obviously designed to house thousands of scrolls, and inside it, a sarcophagus. Faced with a unique mix of two totally different buildings, a library and a mausoleum, the scholars set out to discover the reason why. To be buried, as in this case, right in the center of the city, was an honor granted only to someone who deserved to be remembered as a hero. The discovery of a number of inscriptions revealed that the building had been erected by Julius Aquila Ptolemaios in honor and memory of his father Celsus, a senator and magistrate. By building a library in front of his father's tomb, Julius sought to remind his fellow citizens that a man attained heroic status only through the wisdom contained in the thousands of parchment scrolls, the forerunners of our present-day books, that were housed in this amazing library. The Library of Celsus from the 2nd century AD is one of the finest examples of Hellenistic architecture. The central columns are taller than those along the sides, just as the upper columns are shorter than those below. What we see, in fact, is something straight out of the theater. The architect makes his facade leap upward in a surge of movement, and it is this movement, which is foreign to classicism, that is one of the typical characteristics of Hellenistic art. The most famous monument at Ephesus, however, is a colossal work, one that would inspire awe for centuries, the Temple of Artemis. I have seen the gardens of Babylon, the statue of Olympian Zeus, the Colossus of Rhodes, the pyramids of Egypt, the Pharos of Alexandria, and the mausoleum of Halicarnassus. But having seen the Temple of Artemis, which reaches the very clouds, all the other wonders fade before my eyes. Thus, the Greek writer Pausanias described the temple, comparing it with the 6 other wonders of the ancient world. His words sent archaeologists out to track down the Artemisium, but for many years the monument remained a chimera, shrouded in mystery. Many gave up. Byron himself was disappointed by the place. I have beheld the Ephesians' miracle. Its columns strew the wilderness, and dwell the hyena and the jackal in their shade. But time never did completely obliterate the ruins of Ephesus. Though abandoned and neglected, the city has always been recognizable, and scholar after scholar has tried to identify a square or a temple from the base or drum of a column. Not everyone lost heart, like Byron. In 1866, during excavations near this theater, an inscription was found that revealed where the Artemisium lay. Unfortunately, of that wonder of the ancient world, only a single column now remains. The temple, the largest in the Greek world, was over 370 feet long and 175 feet wide, and its columns were nearly 60 feet high. Construction started in 560 BC and lasted almost 100 years with constant restoration. The roofless colonnaded interior housed a primitive statue of Artemis, and the columns of the porch carried reliefs of mythical characters. There were likely a considerable number of votive statuettes. Then, as now, one of the most popular souvenirs from Ephesus was the figure of the goddess, a cult idol. The Romans built their advanced cities in Hellenistic style. A wonderful example is the ruins of Leptis Magna, an archaeological site near Tripoli, Libya. Thanks to the dedicated labors of a succession of archaeological missions, magnificent buildings have been unearthed and rebuilt. We can now admire Hellenistic monuments built 500 years after the time of Alexander the Great. The ruins here show that Hellenism was no momentary fashion trend, here today, gone tomorrow. It has left its indelible mark on all the arts of humankind. The other major Hellenistic city in Ionia was Pergamum. Excavations here at the sanctuary of Asclepius revealed an imposing complex capable of holding vast crowds. They came for the miracle-working waters that could cure terrible diseases. Asclepius was the god of medicine, and it was widely believed that bathing in these miraculous springs, observing a diet based on these waters, could cure any illness. from great physicians of the day, the most famous of all being Galen. His name lives on today in the word pharmacists use to describe traditional, handmade, vegetable-based medications, Galenical. Besides the famous sanctuary and temples, Pergamum established itself as the preeminent artistic and intellectual center of Anatolia. It was this city that revolutionized the art of writing through its invention of a new writing surface, parchment. Pergamum, in fact, was the site of one of the largest libraries in the ancient world, comparable in importance only to that of Alexandria. According to a legend recounted by Pliny, King Ptolemy V of Egypt refused to supply papyrus to King Eumenes II of Pergamum in the 2nd century BC, for fear that he would create a library greater than his own. Eumenes therefore resolved to perfect the treatment of sheepskin so that it could be made fine and easy to handle, and as suitable for writing on as papyrus. The result, parchment, made him self-sufficient, and his library eventually surpassed even that of Alexandria. Pergamum also boasted an unusual theater, as tall as it is deep. 80 rows of seats rising over 100 feet up a hillside, so incredibly steep it made the job of building it virtually impossible. Why would they have built something so daring? After archaeologists had excavated the Acropolis, the upper city of Pergamum, it dawned on them that all the most important constructions had been built on a series of overhanging terraces. It is clear from this model of the Acropolis that at the center of this highly dramatized cityscape was the theater. The entire city had been designed to impress the visitor and heighten the splendor of the panorama below. Walking through the city, a perfect example of Hellenism, visitors would have learned a prime lesson of the new Hellenistic culture: shock, surprise, impress. The great altar of Zeus at Pergamum is one of the few wonders of the ancient world we can still admire today in all its beauty. But today, it's not in Pergamum, but at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. I stood there sadly, looking at the magnificent Corinthian capitals, each as tall as a man, the rich bases and other architectural elements, all overgrown and covered with undergrowth and wild figs. Nearby, smoke rose from a lime kiln, into which all the marble blocks that could be hammered into fragments ended up. In these words, in 1865, archaeologist Carl Humann described the day when he reached the Acropolis of Pergamum. For years the site had lain in total abandonment. The remains of the magnificent buildings were being used as a quarry. The marble was being burned down into lime. One of the greatest treasures of the artistic heritage of mankind was being reduced to dust. Humann and German Kaiser Wilhelm I pressured the Turkish Prime Minister until Humann was granted permission to excavate. He started to unearth the first of the many marble slabs in high relief. Comparing such slabs with classical accounts, the German scholars confirmed that they had definitely belonged to the Great Altar of Pergamum. 129 slabs carved with figures in high relief, 130 inscriptions, and other statues, friezes, and architectural elements were brought to light and soon were on their way to Berlin. These two trees grow today is where the once great altar of Pergamum stood, built by sculptors trained at Pergamum who who were the fathers of a new art style. The work of Human, the Pergamon Museum, and archaeologists allows us to see how this ancient monument would have looked in all its splendor. The building was not tall, under 30 feet in fact, but it made an impressive dramatic impact all the same, mostly because of the sculptures that decorated it. Access to the altar was through a very small staircase, which enhanced the monument's visual impact. The Great Altar was a building unique in its own right. It was not a temple, had no college of custodian priests, and was open to all in every respect. It had also clearly been created with self-glorification in mind. The Pergamines wanted it to celebrate their military prowess. Above the plinth, the Great Altar at Pergamum featured an Ionic colonnade. The monument itself, an original Pergamene invention both in its form and in its decoration, was 117 feet long and 110 feet deep. It was enclosed on 3 sides, while the fourth, which faced west and overlooked the valley, was occupied by the great stairway leading to the center of the colonnade, where the altar itself was located. The altar was considered the most important building in the city. It was constructed at the height of the Hellenistic period, during the time of the Attalid kings, when Pergamum gave its name to one of the 4 Hellenistic kingdoms. Long before Pergamum came under Roman rule, the Pergamines had defeated the Galatians, the Celtic barbaric tribe who raided the country, sacking and plundering. The altar was built to commemorate the victory of civilization over barbarism. In the inner court, aside from the altar, is a smaller frieze, the so-called Telephus frieze. Here, inside the colonnade, the sculptures tell the story of Telephus, the founding hero of the city, who was the son of Heracles. The Greeks' zeal for self-celebration, already evident in the classic period, was just as strong in the Hellenistic period. But the main story here is told by the larger frieze, surrounding the plinth itself. This frieze is made up of stone slabs 7.5 feet high, that once formed a continuous sequence 130 yards long. The frieze tells the story of the battle of gods and giants. The giants, who represent the forces of evil, have attacked Olympus, the home of the gods, the incarnation of good. The metaphor is obvious. This is the war in which the kingdom of Pergamum fought and defeated the barbarians. The Great Frieze was not the work of just one man. Many artists contributed to it, seeking a new way of conceiving art, a new way of glorifying the power and grandeur of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The interaction between the Greek culture of the Macedonians and the non-Greek societies of the old Persian Empire brought us artistic innovation. During this period, artists and architects, poets and philosophers sculpted more than individual statues. They built aesthetic foundations that would last for thousands of years. The culture that resulted, Hellenism, which depicts elan and beauty with such realism, and which exalts human emotion in such grand fashion, has become, for us in the West, the fountainhead of all the arts.